Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week on our weekly call for community solutions hosted by the Forbes Funds and the Greater Pittsburgh Nonprofit Partnership. We've been hosting these calls since March of 2020 in an effort to provide nonprofits with updates, share public policy information, and create a space to discuss any challenges, resources, and opportunities that exist. We want to have a better understanding of the short and long-term community needs during this time. As always, please feel free to drop your name and organization in the chat and use the chat to engage with our speaker and our staff to ask questions. Today, we welcome our guest speaker, Phil Falva from the United Way. And as always, brief, you can go to the next slide too. We align these calls with our frameworks, which include the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the social determinants of health and equity, and our 8 R's: return on assets, equity, investment, policy, relationships, sustainability, technology, and well-being. Fred, I want to give you some space at the beginning of the call to welcome us, as always, before I turn it over to our guest, Phil, from the United Way of PA.
Thank you all. As you know, it's warming up. I've been in 2 meetings this morning and I'm already having some sense of perspiration. So I would ask people to get out early and get their steps in. Health is wealth. I'm excited to hear Phil in particular as we begin this new era, new framework of policies and practices. I think we've been trained and conditioned as stakeholders in the ecosystem to react to 2 and 4 year cycles with promises made by politicians that aren't driven by policies, but by promises. And so Phil's work is critically important to help us understand at a deeper level how policy is used to transform communities, to preserve the rights of others, and to push the system to think differently about how it functions and operates given the stressors and shocks to our ecosystem. As a result of COVID, things are moving at a very expeditious rate, yet many of our colleagues and cohort members still operate in a pre-pandemic mode. We're concerned that some of that lag or inability to be agile, iterative, will have a direct bearing on their bottom line. And so since COVID, we have, in partnership with many other people, began to really push this notion of what is innovation, what is transformation. It all requires policy at some level to really drive systemic change. This is not a fly-by-night process. Moreover, it's a cacophony of things coming together that are driven by policies. My last comment is, it is important, it is incumbent upon us to diversify the people who draft policy. In many instances, those people who draft policy are well-meaning people who did not have or walk in the footsteps of some of the policies they support. I was in a meeting on Thursday in Philadelphia with I was sitting in the office with $30 billion in assets. And we were talking about an issue that they wanted to resolve. And as we began to digest the issue, it was clear to me about an hour into the meeting, we weren't having the same conversation. We were targeting the same issue, but not the solution. And so it was interesting, and I'll say this, and this is just meant as something to consider. If you've never been hungry and you're designing a policy for hungry people, it doesn't reflect ever being hungry. It reflects understanding and having empathy for people that's hungry. And so I think it's important to understand from the foundation from which some things are designed, do we have an authentic view by which policy is being driven? And if so, how are we ensuring the integrity of that policy cuts across race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic strata? So thank you, and I look forward to hearing Phil's presentation.
Thanks so much, Fred. We'll bring the slides back up really quickly and introduce Phil before we go into his discussion. But this is really centered around the work that happens at the state level, specifically the budget that was recently just passed, and how that budget has things in it that can impact everyday nonprofit operations, as well as opportunities for folks to engage with their local elected officials. Phil is an experienced public policy professional with over 11 years of state government experience. Prior to joining the United Way, he served as the Democratic Executive Director of Gaming Oversight Committee in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And before that, he was the Democratic Executive Director of the House Children and Youth Committee. Phil earned a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Susquehanna University and a Master's in Public Administration. On June 29th, 2023, Phil was appointed to the Children's Trust Fund Board by Governor Shapiro and confirmed by the PA Senate. So Phil, we're really looking forward to hearing your overview and your discussion of the budget and the budget process, as well as take questions from folks joining us on the call. So I will turn it over to you, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Fred, you made some really very good points. One of my high-level analyses of this budget was the rules for advocacy are changing very quickly. In prior years, there were a lot of tenured members of the General Assembly who had an understanding of policy, who knew who the players were on certain issues. But the turnover of 2 years ago has created a new rules of engagement from start to finish. We have a lot of younger, inexperienced legislators who may or may have not served in the public sector, who are focused on policy platforms, but lack the real broad-based knowledge and understanding of the individual experiences of the constituencies that each of us represents. We're seeing now more than ever the power of storytelling and testimonials, and the value of in-person meetings that are backed by data and anecdotal evidence. There was a time when United Way of Pennsylvania walked in the door and everybody knew what our issues were. Now there's more in-depth discussions, and I think that example that Fred gave was really good. You have folks that understand their issues, but they don't understand the right way to get to a solution or the fact that compromise is necessary. One of my biggest takeaways on this budget is we actually saw compromise in Harrisburg. It's a miracle. I'm surprised we didn't have snow the day the budget was signed, to be honest with you. Our members of the General Assembly in my time, when I first got there, used to have dinner together. They would talk. They would find solutions over a beer. Now they wouldn't be seen in the same restaurant. It's really sad because political discourse has gone so far off track of what we expect to be normal human behavior and interaction. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the budget. United Way of Pennsylvania released our budget statement the Friday after the budget was passed. I just dropped it in the chat if anybody wants to check it out. High level analysis, we saw some growth in some very underfunded areas, specifically intellectual disabilities, some more growth in education, but unfortunately, from our perspective, the budget didn't go far enough to help people living paycheck to paycheck, or as we call them, ALICE, which stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. The budget from last year to this year grew by a little over 6%. It was a $2.7 billion increase, which makes this one of Pennsylvania's highest budgets on record to this point. Unfortunately, some of the investments the governor had asked for were either cut down by about 25% of his request, or in some cases not included. From my perspective, we see housing as a national problem. Here in Pennsylvania, the need for affordable housing grows exponentially each day. That was not addressed in the budget. For those who remember the whole home repair program, which was enacted 2 years ago, that seemed like a real groundbreaking program. It's been zeroed out again. Like I said, we did see some pretty big investments in education, but nowhere near enough to address the funding gap that was identified by the Fair Funding Formula lawsuit. We did see some slight increases in pre-K, Head Start, and early childhood education, but again, not enough to address the crisis of childcare here in Pennsylvania. I said this actually on our staff meeting about 20 minutes ago. You know, this budget was truly a compromise because there was no huge winner. Everybody walked away with something, and no one walked away with everything. When you look line by line, you see a lot of increases in single digits. In most years, that does not happen. You can see a clear-cut winner when you see percentage increases of 20 and 30%. There were very few line items that had those kind of increases. Fred mentioned the breakneck speed that we see things changing and moving. I think part of that is there's becoming a greater understanding of need. across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, especially. Last year, we saw a protracted budget fight that went all the way to December for the accompanying code bills. This year, they were able to come to the table and come to an agreement on all pieces of legislation and prevent a long-term stalemate that would hurt nonprofit organizations. I'm fortunate enough to serve on Panel's Public Policy Committee with Emily. We have had some very in-depth discussion about the power of collective voice. For those who don't know, in the past 2 years, we have done appropriations presentations with a variety of nonprofit partners to talk with members of the Appropriations Committee and their staff about the value of funding nonprofit organizations and addressing our asks so that we can dedicate more time and money into the direct frontline service and less into actually funding those services. We're noticing more and more that has resulted in a lot of questions and a lot of interest from legislators, especially our newer ones. Representative Abigail Salisbury brought back the nonprofit caucus last year. That has been a new conduit for us to share our asks with members of the General Assembly. We're learning more and more that the collective voice of nonprofit is valuable because we're not living through the Hunger Games of budgets where we're all trying to cannibalize up a small pot of money. This budget especially, we saw additional growth in the rainy day fund and more funds were deposited. It's north of 14 billion because they are in interest-bearing accounts and we do see the economy continue to boom. I suspect that number will be about 15 billion by the time we're at time to negotiate the next budget. I am a firm believer in fiscal expedience, but I do think with that kind of money sitting in rainy day funds, there's a great opportunity for nonprofits to work together to talk about the value of investment in our communities. I think that's something we could really do, and we should start now because of the way the Commonwealth budget process unfolds. So right now you have agencies in the rebudget process. So they are going through the funds allocations and determining what their ability to fund programs is. And then next month, they will start to craft their budget requests to go to the budget secretary for next year. So we're right in the middle of budget season already, and most people do not recognize that. In terms of funding across the board, as I mentioned, we saw a lot of increases in areas. Something I noticed a lot of, general government operations received quite a bit of funding in some agencies. That tells me there's going to be some discretionary funds available and new grant opportunities based on the amount of funding that's available. Agencies such as DCED saw some pretty big increases in GGO. The Workforce Development Office under the Department of Labor got a nice increase. However, a lot of that was for labor law enforcement. We again saw the General Assembly invest in tax credits. This will be the third consecutive year we saw tax credits investments. The newest one being employer support for employers that pay contribution towards 529s and towards child care. We also saw for the first time in the state create a non-refundable student loan tax credit of up to $2,500 on PIT liability. So there is some bright light in terms of the investment in people. So I had told Emily I was going to keep this roundtable discussion. I didn't want to sit here and just talk away because there's a lot to talk about. I'd rather answer questions and we can deep dive as a group. So fire away.
I want to start off. Thank you, Phil. Can you help us understand how the policies and practice align with the emerging opportunities in the sector and how the funded activity creates a pipeline for such activity at the grassroots level? For example, we keep hearing over and over again about an abundance of manufacturing jobs that are available in the sector. And there's resources on one end, but they don't seem to be connected to getting people to the opportunity. And so walk us through how some of these policies might be aiding in that process and help us understand, if not, how do we play a role in supporting the policies that exist to get it more aligned?
From my perspective, I think there's a big gap between how our legislature and governor define workforce development and what that truly is. There seems to be a big emphasis on the person getting a job, but not those supports that are necessary for them to keep it. Childcare being a primary example, we see continued need in the childcare sector, yet we don't see the funding to match that need. So one of the investments in the budget was to take childcare subsidy up to the 75th percentile. As a result of the pandemic, Pennsylvania has increased its eligibility all the way up to 300% of the federal poverty level, or 85% of the statewide median income, the lower of the two for an individual. However, that person still has to enter into child care subsidy at that 200% of the federal poverty level. So while there's opportunity for growth and advancement in careers and addressing some of that concern around benefits cliffs, it's still not addressing the whole need of individuals. We know there are folks that have transportation problems. We know affordable housing is an issue. And while we're seeing some investment in those areas, it's just the starting point. There needs to be a broader conversation between employers, the workforce, and our decision makers about what it truly means to leave the home and enter the workforce and what that impact is, because it's not just a single person impact. In some cases, it impacts children, spouses, and senior parents whom are living with their adult children. Some of that conversation needs to be centered around the whole person. There's a thought that if a person gets a job, they can address all of their financial needs at once, and we know that's not true. We see that with benefits cliffs. We see how often folks are not willing to take a raise because that's going to mean a loss in thousands of dollars in support. At the same time, we do see the investments to start that process. Workforce development received additional funding. There were investments to increase childcare. There's a new healthcare subsidy program that will offset the cost of individuals transitioning from MA to Penny. It's a little controversial because of the sources of the funding, but these are good first steps to helping people address need as they go into the workforce, so they don't face a big bill because they received a salary that they hadn't previously received.
I got a question.
Sure.
So far, I like what you were saying, Phil. I'm sorry. My comment is that I noticed that over the last couple months, I've been following. The state been pouring down hundreds and hundreds of $100 million for prevention, intervention, violence program. Then earlier you had mentioned that some places are short funded. Do you really think that we actually really need to spend this type of money? If I turn around, there's 50 coming in, there's $5 million to the county. So my question to you, what do you think in perspective, is that the way to go, to just throw all this money out there to address the violence in our neighborhoods?
I mean, from my personal perspective, I think they need to get to root causes. It's just like what we see with education funding, this dire need to put additional dollars in, but we need to figure out why some school districts are so underfunded. Even with neighborhood violence, so what's the root cause? Is it homelessness? Is it a continued expansion of substance use disorder? Is it because some folks are struggling with mental health and don't know where to find the resources? Throwing money at the problem is not always the best solution, but that's where
Correct. Yes.
ours are able to then have an impact and talk about, use the data and talk about the experiences we have on the ground floor. Because like I said, our legislators are following trends. If you've ever looked at the National Conference of State Legislature websites, they have all kinds of model legislation. The problem with model legislation is it's a broad look. Yes. And states have to be able to really craft solutions that address the root causes. And in some instances, because we are moving at that breakneck speed, they're not able to look at root causes. They're trying to fix problems as they go because government's generally reactive.
So otherwise, do you think, as far as nonprofits, of those receiving this funding, that there should be some type of guideline and structure showing like what are you doing and how you target the population, what areas that you're basically trying to cover. See, now everybody can get this grant money, Phil, and
So
just
you're
say,
talking
well,
about,
we're doing this.
so when you're talking about like the dollars through PCCD, they have a lot of requirements for investment in outcomes. That's because some of those dollars kick down from the federal government, and to utilize those grant dollars, you have to show outcomes. The problem is it's hard to address some of those measurable outcomes because they take time.
Yes.
Olivia mentioned that I'm on the Children's Trust Fund board. When we fund child abuse prevention, a lot of the requirements include measurables over time. So basically, a nonprofit entity would outline their goals, and then every couple of months they have to submit how the funds are being utilized and measurable outcomes. In some cases, they're very measurable. Sometimes they're not. But at the end of the day, if you see some ROI on that investment, like say crime rates go down, or you have lower instances of overdoses, or whatever issue it may be, you're clearly making some level of progress. I don't think it's a matter of outcomes. I think it's of measuring the outcomes. I think it's a matter of finding solutions that can work. And I think that's where nonprofits do come in because of the experience they have with the boots on the ground.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Something too, I mean, if you're talking about issues like neighborhood violence, or honestly, coalitions are getting to be the way to address some of these issues. Finding groups that work on issues like we do, that on financial stability, finding groups that focus on homelessness and food insecurity, working with providers that work in areas of mental health and substance use disorder. Really and truly, like whole person solutions and holistic solutions are trending a trending issue in some states. Pennsylvania is a little behind the time on that, but we're getting there.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. What else?
Well, I can jump in with a question. You mentioned, budget was just passed, but we're kind of already in the next season for next year's budget. Are there any things that you're seeing that maybe weren't in this budget or weren't as well funded in this budget that nonprofits can focus on for next year? I only ask because I think it was around this time where there was the environmental disaster in Ohio, but less than 4 miles away from the Pennsylvania border, and a lot of the nonprofits that Emily were engaging with we're talking about how to build those coalitions around environmental justice and get funding to support this work. So would love to maybe hear your thoughts on anything that folks can do to maybe think about how to elevate issues for next year's budget.
So one of the best things you could do, which we do, schedule a meeting with the budget secretary as soon as you possibly can and get in and talk about your priorities. If you have not met Secretary Munson yet, he is a very down-to-earth gentleman. He loves policy. He loves data. I will tell you right now, the more data you can give him, the better your opportunities are. The one takeaway we have from this administration, which we haven't seen in the past, is they're very focused on thematic budgets. We're hearing this coming year is going to be a human services centered budget. That does not mean they won't make necessary investments in areas that need to be addressed. When you look at the funding that was in this budget, you saw some pretty big cuts in the area of environmental energy and resources. You saw state parks take a big cut, which I was very surprised by, only for additional funding to go into oil and gas drilling. Our state parks are the lifeblood of our tourism here in Pennsylvania. We have some of the most beautiful state parks on the eastern half of this country. To see that cut was kind of surprising, but utilizing talking points around that to emphasize the need to protect our environment because the governor has launched such a large, wide-scale emphasis on tourism would be very, very helpful. Same with other issues. Pay attention to some of the governor's press releases and the issues they're trying to fund through discretionary funding. That will help you immensely. But like I said, it starts with data. Because the budget secretary is already in the process of the rebudget with the agencies, their requests will start to come in around September or October. That'll give you ample time to talk about what you feel is a need. And I would probably attack it on two fronts by going to your secretary, the secretaries or deputy secretaries and at the same time having the conversation with the budget secretary. So neither one side or the other is surprised when it comes up when they start to talk budget in November.
Thanks so much, Phil. And my last question, I apologize, I haven't had a chance to read the budget, but was there any discussion around, I know you mentioned workforce investment, but more towards technology. So at the Forbes Funds, we work a lot with artificial intelligence and generative AI. I was wondering if there had been any kind of points of discussion or investment from the state budget level in that.
If you saw a debate, sorry, I'm a nerd. I watch all of it because I work there. If you noticed any of the debate, AI came up a few times in discussion. There's a lot of apprehension around AI because of the security aspect of it. Also liability. There were discussions around using AI, and there's an implementation line for AI. I forget which agency it was in, but it will help address some of the intake. I think it was actually unemployment comp. It will help address some of the intake. So we saw during the pandemic how grossly understaffed some of the agencies were and what those hangups looked like. The AI in itself is in its infancy at the state level. You see it as a search tool on some of the new Commonwealth websites. If you haven't checked them out yet, they're actually pretty neat. It's intuitive. But I think when it comes to issues around HIPAA and other compliance and open records provisions, we're not there yet. I do suspect, though, you will start to see pilots because the governor's Office of Innovation is always trying new things. So I got a question in the chat. Do you fund services such as school attendance? We fund quite a bit of areas. Our primary emphases are in financial stability programming. Some local United Ways have community schools, so they fund wraparound supports for families in schools that are struggling to make ends meet. We do have several local United Ways that do some funding to help with childcare assistance. Direct school attendance, we don't, but we do have some local United Ways that are focused on truancy rates. So there are certain areas of the Commonwealth, I think York County is one of them, where they have very high truancy rates. And they are trying to fund programs to raise awareness about the importance of school attendance. In September, we do a brand refresh. We're going to create a repository of all programs related to ALICE that'll be publicly accessible, so we can show what every local United Way is doing to address financial stability in our communities. So I would say stay tuned for that. When that launches, I can give the link to Emily to share out with all of you.
That would be great. Thank you, Phil. Are there any other questions from folks on the call this morning?
Yeah, I just got one more question. Phil, could you please be more specific and detailed and give examples? You mean by financial stability?
Sure. So it's issues like housing affordability and rental assistance, eviction prevention. At the same time, so we know this population exists of people who are struggling to make ends meet despite working. We focus on programs that help fill those gaps, especially because that's the population who tends to struggle with the benefits cliff. I can't say too much about it, but we're going to be launching a benefits cliff campaign next month. We are heavily invested in addressing those needs where there are gaps for individuals who are just coming off of human services programs, but still not making enough. Some of our local United Ways do things like reassessment assistance for folks living in counties that are doing tax reassessment. We have 2 local United Ways who have a car program for individuals who don't have access to transportation, where they provide low interest loans and they connect an individual with a reliable vehicle, and it covers maintenance for up to 2 years.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Olivia, I have a question.
Sure, jump in.
So, hi, Phil. So could you maybe talk a bit about how youth are being engaged in some of this public policy work? at the United Way. Now, I know that you had really interesting background too when you served as the executive director of the House Children and Youth Committee. So you have experience in this, but I'm just curious thinking about young nonprofit leaders and how they're being engaged in this work.
Personally, I don't think they're being engaged enough. I think proactivity is the best step you could take. Prime example is how panel brought voices to the table because folks weren't sure how to engage their legislators. I think it takes a lot of effort nowadays to actually get access to legislators in the Capitol. One of the best things you can do is go see your local legislators because you're also a constituent. There needs to be more engagement in the nonprofit sector from my perspective. The best solutions are going to involve the public sector, the private sector, and especially nonprofits. There seems to be this feeling that only one sector can fund a solution, and there's no way that the sectors can work together, and I think that's totally wrong. The best solutions are going to come with investment from government, private entities, and nonprofit organizations who are able to address needs. I do see more efforts to bring new voices and faces to the table because our younger generation of legislators is seeing that the way we've always done it is not working anymore. If you have opportunities to meet with legislators or some cabinet secretary or even your local elected officials, take it because that's how you build relationships. If you feel like you're not being engaged enough, whatever your issue is, raise it to the forefront through social media, start tagging your local elected officials. If it's a community problem, try to host community conversations. That's how you get your name out there.
Thank you. Yeah, because one of the work we're trying to do at the Forbes Funds and GPNP is really thinking about youth engagements on all of these discussions. And so, if we have a group of young people who are a part, of this nonprofit process, and they're really starting to think about how public policy is going to impact their organization, could you be a resource for them, or could we connect young people, your way to sort of ask questions?
Sure. So I think most organizations don't understand the value of legislation and public policy. Somewhere along the line, there was these walls put up between what nonprofits should and should not do. But advocacy is a huge part of nonprofit work. It's not all advocacy is lobbying. Part of it is making sure our educators are well informed. And that starts with building relationships so there is a level of trust. I'm a known commodity. I have legislators reach out to me all the time. I encourage folks who are not just to go to the Capitol for a day, drop in and introduce yourself. If you're not in Harrisburg, go meet your local legislators and introduce yourself. It doesn't hurt. It really doesn't hurt to build those relationships because at the end of the day, they're just people. You're just introducing yourself to new people. What other questions can I answer? So I'll ask one. We saw and we continue to monitor responses to this budget. We continue to see that a lot of organizations are disappointed. In some cases, because they had big asks. I mean, we're very disappointed because we were asking for additional funding for 211. And now we're in the third year of working on a state or an income tax credit. We always seem to get close, but we can't get across the finish line. From a lot of your perspectives, it sounds like that's the truth about some of your issues too. Is anybody thinking about new ways to engage or elevate voices around your particular issues?
I do, Phil. So you had mentioned about to meet and talk with your government officials.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with the Congresswoman Summer Lee. Basically, it's hard to get with the actual person. You would be meeting and having meetings with the her staff. I had one, I had to have a meeting with her staff. We did a presentation regarding to job training for workforce development, and that it's true you need to have engagement, but you have to go through talk with the office people, and they would pass it along and go for there. Because I noticed that, yeah, you called what's your name office and they said, well, he's not here, he's in Harrisburg or DC. So you have to commute your information, what initiative with their staff, and that if something's interesting that would benefit their constituents, they will help you also find financial resources and the people that you need to connect with to move forward. So I'm getting ready to move forward with an initiative out in basically in the Martin Valley area for starters.
I will tell you, and you'll hear this from a lot of paid lobbyists, because I'm a lobbyist. There's more value sometimes in talking to the staff than there is the actual legislator. So their staff are the experts. And I'm not just saying that because I was a staffer, it's the truth. Members' time, especially in the General Assembly, is so spread thin. Then when you think about a county commissioner who's basically the legislature and the administrative branch, their time's spread even thinner. There are folks that work in Harrisburg and DC, and in some cases in district offices, who are actual experts in certain policy areas. And if you're fortunate enough to gauge one of those folks who are very invested in that policy area, it opens up a lot of doors because you have a good contact who can also share information. Legislators tend to be very high level on their knowledge. When they walk into meetings, they're given a fact sheet of all the issues related to a bill, and in some cases talking points. I don't know if anybody saw the chat, but Ashley's 100% correct. Sandy, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to, I'm sorry I was late to the meeting, but you mentioned earlier, and I'm with Westmoreland Cultural Trust. So arts and culture and arts. And you mentioned earlier that we'd do better if we started collaborating more and becoming a group. What is the smartest way to go, aside from how we all know to be collegial, what's the smartest way from a funding aspect to go after these funds as a network, if you will, or as a consortium of people who are concerned, for instance, substance abuse and homelessness and mental health issues can certainly be affected by arts and culture and arts and cultural programs. And we're kind of interested in things like that here, but I want to make sure that I'm not wasting a whole lot of time. If I get 4 or 5 of us together, what's the best office to hit? What's the smartest way for funding?
So you kind of just did it in presenting issues that tie in together. That funding varies. It really depends on how you want to utilize those funds. The Commonwealth has a lot of grant programs. There are direct allocations you can get from funds from the legislators directly. We had a local United Way who was approached by a nonprofit organization focusing on AEDs in schools. They were really struggling to secure funding because for some reason AEDs in schools is a political issue. Our local United Way was able to secure $250,000 to put AEDs in Chester schools. It's a matter of unifying your message and knowing where to go. Legislators themselves have a lot of discretionary funds. Sometimes it's good to start local, build a relationship within your local governments and work your way up to your area legislators. I have to tell our local United Ways all the time, the public policy process is deliberately slow. Things don't happen in a year or 2 years. When I was in the General Assembly, I saw a policy through that took 10 years. It happens because it takes time to educate and really demonstrate that need. So being patient is another part of it.
Okay.
It does not hurt to start with your local government at the same time, work your way through the state level and see if you can come to some kind of middle ground. I'm noticing more and more a trend where new policies and programs that are being created that benefit communities, there needs to be some buy-in from those local communities or the General Assembly is not willing to fund.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks so much. Are there any other questions from folks on the call this morning? Fred, you look like you're about to speak.
Phil, one of the things that I'm concerned about, and I'm not sure where the governor's office is and at the state level, is for the last 30 years, our region, Southwestern PA and Philadelphia, have a turnpike relationship, right? One is seen as innovative, one is seen as a tier one city, which don't have to play well with others, right? When we think about what's required and what's needed, it doesn't seem that this at the government level, we're clear at a state level, what's the North Star for Pennsylvania? As we're recognized as the second oldest state in the country, are we a tech sector, finance sector, med sector? Like, what is our sector? Because I don't believe that the education systems and supporting frameworks are developing a skill set that supports the region's trajectory. Secondly, we're bleeding talent. In Southwestern PA, we graduate 40,000 kids a year, 20,000 of them leave the day after graduation. And so how are we thinking about preserving talent and also using the pulpit of the governor's resources as a framework to really push that agenda? And then the last component is, I was at the governor's mansion a few months ago, and this is something that really concerns me. And it's not a plus or a minus, but I'm trying to figure out, and hopefully you can help us figure this out. The governor made mention of his development plan around supporting small minority businesses, and he's dedicated resources to that. For the life of me, I've been designing something, working on something. I don't know how to get to that resource. I was in a meeting on Saturday till like 11 o'clock at night with 40 small businesses that I'm trying to help them figure out how to tap that resource and create an ecosystem that doesn't exist.
So I'll start with your last question. The governor's office of business innovation is in DCED. There is an office of minority, veteran-owned, and women-owned businesses. That funding is there. It's allocated every year. Some of that money comes from the Federal Small Business Administration. Some of it comes from the state coffers. And if you give me your email address, I will get you a link to all that information because I know where to get it.
I will do that post-haste.
I'm actually going to drop my email in the chat here in a minute. I might as well do that now with my phone number. Some of your other questions. So this is you're getting at the heart of an issue we raised around the state earned income tax credit. There are currently no incentives to keep young working families here in Pennsylvania or to bring them in. We see the issues that we have around property taxes. We're recognizing more and more that the cost of education here, we're 49th in the nation in funding higher education for our own in-state students. We are not doing the necessary or taking on the necessary actions to address the bleed of our younger, talented folks because they are leaving because they're finding great incentives. That's why we backed the earned income tax credit because it does incentivize work. All of our neighboring states have one except for West Virginia. At the same time, we are seeing more and more funding in terms of economic development going to business to create jobs, but nobody working. We're a graying state. We're fourth in the nation in terms of an aging population. If the trend continues here, we have a likelihood of being second again. There was a time Pennsylvania was the second oldest state in the country. Right now, we have Florida, California, and Arizona ahead of us. If the trend continues, we're going to have a lot of problems. The message is hard to share because you have political divisiveness and you have one side of the aisle that feels any kind of program that gives money back to people is human services or welfare, and that's just not true. I think it would be beneficial for more nonprofit sectors to talk about the dangers. I know that Pano has done a pretty good job of it. We emphasize heavily in some of our partners about what's going to happen if we continue to see this bleed of younger talent, because you can invest all the money you want in job creation. If you have nobody to work in them, it's just a wasted investment.
I like to follow up on what Fred said. He brought up a good point, and my perspective is that I'm speaking about the tech sector. They're bringing in a whole lot of tech companies, as Fred was referring to. They're still leaving. So we got to find out what has to take place for them to stay and get these high-paying tech positions. I just thought what Fred said is very strange that a lot of them moving out in the areas where these companies are coming in. I agree, Fred. How do we keep them here? I don't know.
So Melody asked a good question in the chat. Isn't the talent leaving for better jobs and better quality of life? Yes, but it's the other way around, better quality of life and better jobs. The cost in Pennsylvania to live just continues to grow and grow and grow, and wages are not keeping up. We're still a state with a $7.25 minimum wage. We have a very regressive tax system where the lowest earners are paying the most in their overall income to live. And they're paying the most towards taxes. So we're not all really experiencing infrastructure the same. Fred, one question you asked that I forgot, like what's our sector here in Pennsylvania? Number 1 and 2 sectors are always interchangeable. It's agriculture and tourism. We are a huge tourism state. We're also, believe it or not, still a huge agricultural state, despite the amount of green space that continues to go away each year. Those are always our big sectors, but John is right. We're seeing more and more investment in tech sector. You're going to see a lot more with broadband expansion here in the coming months. The federal dollars that trickled down just for broadband broadband expansion were a significant investment that are being made here in Pennsylvania by the Broadband Development Authority. Problem with trying to retain is you have to show a value in the place you live. We do see good jobs here in Pennsylvania, but it took the pandemic to get wages caught up. Now it costs more to retain an employee, but that cost is now passed on to the consumer. Questions?
I'm not seeing any more questions, so I do want to say thank you, Phil, for joining us this morning and answering questions and providing an overview of the budget. Also, for folks that might have missed it, Phil did drop his contact info in the chat, so please make sure to capture that and build a relationship, engage, and learn more about how nonprofits can, again, play a role in what the priorities of the budget might be next year and the years beyond, and also engage with your local electeds as well, who can provide insight and answers, as well as their staff that can really lean into some of the issues that everyone is seeing. So Phil, I do want to give you time to wrap up before we go into public policy updates and updates from the Forbes Funds.
Sure. I think a lot of folks made great points. I encourage you to be vocal. Do not sit back and just assume that legislators are talking about issues that are affecting your communities or those priorities that you have. I think moving forward, we keep hearing this buzzword of workforce development. Unfortunately, there's not a big understanding of what it takes to get a person employed and to keep them employed. At the same time, we need to get our legislators more focused on being proactive than reactive. Unfortunately, that's an epidemic of government across the board. Our government's always reactive. But the reality is we are at a crossroads right now. We are a much older state that's seeing a lot of business and job development, but we can't get people here. We can't get them to stay. Or if they do leave, it's because there's no incentive to stay. I think working together as a collective voice and building relationships, not just within our own community, but with the for-profit sector and government are great steps to really start addressing challenges holistically. That's my spiel. I'm going to give the same one on Thursday in Washington, D.C.
Phil, we just want to give something for you guys to think about. We do know why the conference recruits so many people a year and they only stay for 2 years or less. The culture is somewhat toxic. It doesn't matter how much you pay people. If you put in their families in a space that they feel uncomfortable and violated, that kind of talent's not going to stay in our region. And so for whatever reason, our region refuses to look at the causal relationship between people being recruited here, who get paid a lot of money, and why they leave. It's like they just keep pouring more money at the problem. And people's like, I get paid enough money. It's not money. And the corporations seem to refuse to want to ask that question. I believe they don't want the answer, or I don't know what's going on, but this has been going on for at least 3 decades.
A question or a statement?
Oh, Fred, was that a question or just a more broad, general, important statement?
It was both something to offer for consideration at the state level to explore, in particular with the governor's interest on supporting businesses who've been marginalized or disadvantaged. That here's the deal, Phil. Even while many people think that they're creating a level playing field when they open the door, but they're opening the door to somebody who's already still in the basement, right? And they're like, well, why ain't nobody coming? They're in the basement. They got to get up out of the basement to get to the same level as the opportunity. And then when they get there, the environment isn't conducive for the diversity they bring to the table, right? The culture, right? And so it's not it's a question to think about when you start like asking a deeper question, like what is the culture of Pennsylvania? Because you said something not many people know. If the largest industries are agriculture and tourism, we seem to be focused on technology and the med sector, and not our largest generator of business, which is, I've never heard that said publicly. Like this is what generates wealth for our region.
Mm-hmm. Well, remember one thing, words are nice when they're on paper or social media, but there's also got to be some accountability of the folks who are tweeting and saying them, right? We've had offices that fund women and minority-owned and veteran-owned businesses for years upon years upon years. I remember in 2008, Jake Wheatley standing on the floor complaining about the lack of funding for minority and women-owned businesses. It's 2024, 16 years later, and we're still in the same spot. There needs to be more accountability around programs like that if we're truly going to address our economic needs. You're right. Most people don't know what our number 1 and number 2 industries are here in Pennsylvania, but they've always been those two. If you are in the Philadelphia region, the amount of tourism there actually funds almost a third of the budget here in Pennsylvania. Southwest PA is the same way. It probably funds about a quarter of the budget for Pennsylvania. It's something to think about when you hear legislators talk about investment. What does that really mean, and who's that really affect?
I have a question.
Could I comment on that, on Fred's question as well? I am an individual who was born, and my name is Anita Russell, and I have done some anti-racism work with the Forbes Fund. But I am one of those individuals who was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I left Pittsburgh in the 80s. And the number one reason I left Pittsburgh was because the field that I wanted to work in simply wasn't available here. My background is in the pharmaceutical industry. And in order for me to have the kind of research career that I needed to have, I needed to leave the city. So I was away from the city of Pittsburgh for nearly 3 decades. And I relocated back. I mean, I came and visited family and all of that, but not actively living here for about 30 years. And when I came back in 2017 to sort of return here, what I found was a lot of change, right? But a lot of change, like in the physical sense, like Oakland. I went to the University of Pittsburgh. Oakland looks completely different from the way that it looked when I was there. I graduated from Pitt in 1980. And so I see all of this dynamic change, but my feeling is that change was really just on the surface. Like you have a lot of this surface looking change, but fundamentally, the culture, and I would even go so far as to say the identity of Pittsburgh hasn't really changed all that much. in those 30 years when I was gone. So me coming back, living somewhere else, completely different experiences and all of that. Initially, I felt like completely like a fish out of water. And it took me a while to kind of infuse my own identity, if you will, into the work that I do here in the city of Pittsburgh. But that was the biggest thing that I recognize, is that the fundamental identity of the city had not changed very much. And so I look at all of the discussions that we're having now, and I'm very intrigued by how do we change the identity so that the city of Pittsburgh works for all of its people, all of its communities, and that sort of thing.
I don't know if I have an answer to that. Starts with community conversations. Local conversations about needs, about those folks living within the community and what their needs look like. Talking about public interests and how they align and how they diverge across different communities, right? So we've been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion now for several years, but we're still not seeing the progress we should have across the board. I mean, history is about to be made. We have our first Black female presidential candidate. It's 2024. It should have happened a hell of a lot sooner. But we are moving in a more positive trend than what we've seen. It does start with those changes on the facade, but it really does take those deeper changes, and that starts with people. And it really does start with good, effective communication, which a lot of people lack in today's day. So Olivia did put in the chat that we're coming up on time, or it might have been Brianna, sorry. And I do have to jump to another call. So if you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, you have my email address and my phone number. And Fred, I will connect with you to get you that information. And John, I saw your question about more information on truancy. If you email me, I will connect you with the person who's running the truancy program at United Way of York.
Thanks so much.
I'll
Phil.
send you my stuff as well, so feel free to call me as well.
Yep, I got it. I already put it
Thank
in
you.
text.
Thanks so much, Phil. And Bree on our team just launched a poll. Please take the poll. The poll helps inform our upcoming community calls, as well as a lot of our programming here at the Forbes Funds, and as a way for us to really see more tactically what are some of the issues and challenges and opportunities for impact happening here and in our region. Again, Phil, thank you for joining us this morning. Just really quickly, a couple policy updates nationally. The RNC just wrapped up its convention where Donald Trump was officially named as the nominee for president, and J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, was announced as vice president. The DNC convention will be held in August, so in about a month, with President Biden announcing that he will not be running and throwing his support behind VP Kamala Harris. There have been some questions about what happens next. The AP created a nice kind of diagram and timeline for folks to follow on what could be potential outcomes from this new ticket that's being presented. With that, I will say a couple local announcements as well. As a part of the administration, Governor Shapiro announced an election hotline to assist voters with any issues or questions that they might have leading up until November. Folks are able to take advantage of that and ask questions to make sure that we can have as smooth as possible of an election day and help address concerns with voting procedures. Westmoreland approved job and pay raises for human services. So any new positions will see salary increases as well. And then finally, the Shapiro administration secured $500 million for major highway project updates across the Commonwealth. With that, I'll wrap up the call. Again, as a reminder, please take the poll. And for updates from our local, or from the Forbes Funds ecosystem, Bree, I believe, dropped in the chat earlier about our AI cohorts. Our 2.0 version is launching August 8th. We recently wrapped up the first round of these cohorts, and we're anticipating that these cohorts fill up as well. So if you have questions, please register or reach out to our team, specifically Emily on our team, who normally hosts these community calls. Her email is emily@forbesfunds.org. And with that, I guess as a reminder, please take the call. You can see our QR code there on the screen to find out more information on the Forbes Funds. Please click on that code or take your cell phone and get an image of it, and it will direct you directly to our website where you can find out more information about our work. Finally, thank you for joining us. Fred, if you like to have any final words, but I will say, as he did remind us earlier, please get outside and walk, get in your 10,000 steps, enjoy the sunshine or what's left of it today. And I hope you all have a great day, and please join us next week for our community call. Thank you.